is both highly controversial and very, very current in terms of contemporary interest. And we have, I think, an excellent panel to consider the subject that is before us. We will ask each of the panelists to speak briefly, and I will introduce them all together, and then I will give the panelists an opportunity of a minute or two to come back at anything anybody else says that they want to straighten them out on. We will then turn to the audience for questions and for brief comments after questions if there's time. So let me begin by thanking all our panelists and introduce them, if I may, in the order in which they're going to speak. Speaking first will be Richard Haass. I was going to say our own Richard Haass, because as you all know, he was a lecturer in public policy here at the Kennedy School from 85 to 88, and then in 89 joined the administration and is a special assistant to the president and Special Director for Near East and South Asian Affairs. He makes me feel proud and xenophobic because he, like both the other panelists, spent some of his higher education in Britain, where he was a Rhodes Scholar, and he is also the author of many books, the most recent a book that was published last year on the INF Treaty, one I think that might be described as prophetic given recent events. After Richard Haass, our next speaker will be Mr. Odal Aran, who is the Minister Plenipotentiary at the Israeli Embassy in Washington and was previously the head of North American Affairs for the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Prior to that, he was a minister at the Israeli Embassy in London, and he also played a very substantial part in the whole Camp David process as an expert, indeed a leading Israeli expert, in the area of Egyptian affairs and Egyptian history. He also, I take a xenophobic pride in, since he took a PhD at the London School of Economics in modern Egyptian history. Then our final speaker in this initial round will be Helen Cobble, who is a visiting fellow at the George Mason Center for Conflict Analysis and Resolution, a Brookings Institute fellow at the present time, or I think she just concluded being a Brookings Institute fellow, and has, for a number of years past, majored in the whole area of conflict resolution. She was educated at Oxford in philosophy of politics and economics, and she will be addressing this subject from a point of view which reflects her own experience in the area of conflict resolution. So let me begin by asking Richard Haass to speak first, followed by Odal Aran, and then by Helen Cobble.
I will sit. I've taught several classes today, and I'm out of shape as a university teacher. Any of you who have followed the Middle East these days have probably noticed that it's become a matter of higher math. We've got an Israeli 4-point plan, of which there's a 20-point approach to negotiations and election. We've got the Egyptian 10-point plan. You've got the Baker 5-point plan, which the Israelis responded to with 6 assumptions. And we've yet to get a response from the Arab side, but I'm sure there'll be a number attached to that. Now, those of you who ever had me in the classroom also know that the Kennedy School and its wisdom kept me far away from the quantitative side of the curriculum. So I will not engage that, and you will not get any new approaches. Rather, what I will simply try to do is give you a sense of how this administration has gone about the Middle East and why, and in a sense where we think it is and where I hope it is heading. To begin with the obvious, though, we began with the idea that the Middle East is an important place. Amidst the headlines of Eastern Europe, some may have forgotten that, but we haven't. It's important in a positive sense, if you will, because of Israel, because of energy resources, because of the moderate Arab states, with whom we have long, close relations, because of its strategic location. But it's also, in some ways, perhaps just as important in a negative sense. The potential for war among the countries of the region and the potential for escalation. I would say when I look at the portfolio I have, which includes North Africa, the Middle East, the Gulf, and South Asia, what worries me about both the Middle East and South Asia is that there are two parts of the world where one has groupings or clusters of protagonists, where they have all sorts of powerful weaponry, and where the superpowers all have roles at least two of them in the case of the Middle East. One includes the great powers, several more in South Asia, but there's no clear rules of the road. And there remains a great potential for escalation and I think for real danger, as we saw, for example, in 1973. So I think the Middle East remains a dangerous place, if you will, in its own right and for what it could lead to. I think what that leads to is a real need for a viable peace process. Anyone who's been there recently has a sense of the misery, in some ways, of the day-to-day, particularly for those who live under the Intifada. Also that it's just wasteful. There's a sense of tremendous resources going down the drain. In one sense, there's tremendous positive things happening in other parts of the world, whether economically or politically or what have you. And the Middle East at times seems sadly out of step. So anyone who's at all involved with it has a sense that things are not right, things are not what they could be, things are certainly not what they should be. And on top of that, as a result, I think comes some sense that there are some chances. And when we came in and we did our initial interagency national security study and assessment of the Middle East, we came away thinking that there were some positive developments out there, that one ought not to lose sight of them. One had, after all, it had been 10 years since the Camp David accomplishment, which was intact and showed that peacemaking can work in the Middle East. One had Egypt return to the Arab League on its terms. It showed that an Arab country could make peace with Israel and then be accepted back into the Arab fold. In the Arab world, I think it was fair to say there was a general tendency towards moderation, towards greater realism, a sense of almost sobriety about Israel, like it or not, being here to stay, something to deal with. For ourselves, we inherited a dialogue with the PLO that I think gave us a valuable lever to influence one of the important actors in the Middle East. The Intifada had raised a sense on both sides, both Israeli and Palestinian, that the status quo needed to be changed. In Israel, you had a government that was led by one party, and yet a leader who clearly had the conservative credentials that if he wished to make compromises for peace, to a large extent would probably be able to. At the same time, and anyone who's looked at the Middle East would know this, the news was not all good. That there was still tremendous differences in the views of the various parties about where we were going, or where we should be going, about how to get there, and that on all sides you had political leadership that was not yet, in a sense, fully in place or fully secure. There were still many divisions in Israel, but also on the Arab side. You had an awful lot of violence, and any time you have violence, you have a political process in which you're always one bomb away from seeing things totally derailed. You had certain political realities. Israel, for example, unwilling to deal with the PLO. Egypt and Jordan, neither of them were willing to represent the Palestinians. What all this led us to do was make a couple of conclusions or assessments early on. One was that we needed to come up with a process that postponed some of the most difficult and I would say theological issues in the Middle East. That it made no sense to be ambitious and to try to solve the Middle East in one fell swoop. Because then if one raised up issues like statehood for the Palestinians, the status of Jerusalem, or what have you, one was going to confront issues for which there was no consensus and people were simply not ready to compromise on. So first of all, we came up with the idea that you had to postpone, in some ways, the bottom line issues. Secondly, though, we realized that if one postponed them, one could not simply start anew. One had to have a Middle East peace process that was grounded in the familiar, and we decided very early on to continue to base it on the familiar instruments, United Nations Resolutions 242 and 338, the principle of territory for peace, and so on. The idea was that we thought we needed to have a process that was based on familiar ideas, that postponed the most difficult issues, that gave the sides time to build some confidence, to build some trust, and perhaps most important, that would provide or produce a representative, or the word we like to use, an interlocutor for the Palestinian side that had legitimacy and authority on the Palestinian side that Israel would talk to. PLO is not acceptable to the Israelis. Jordanians, Egyptians had again taken themselves out of the game for the time being. So the real focus became how do we get Israelis and Palestinians talking to each other, and who is it that we have represent the Palestinians? And that was where the idea of elections came from. Not as an end in themselves, but as to get something going, to get a process underway which again would produce a Palestinian interlocutor, would come up with some modest initial steps, and then over time could lead to increasingly ambitious questions that are at the heart of the Middle East. And we encouraged the Israelis to think along those lines. They ran with the ball. On May 14th, the Israelis did produce their multifaceted initiative, an important element of which was this proposal for elections in the occupied territories. Very quickly, though, as you always learn in the Middle East, nothing's as simple as it seems or as simple as you'd like it to be. It turned out impossible to get Israelis and Palestinians to meet together to, on the basis of this initiative, to actually set up the elections. We were talking to the various sides. In that context, the Egyptians tried to be helpful, and Mr. Mubarak came forward with his 10 points, hopefully that would be a way of almost lubricating the process, to give the Palestinian side something that they could take to the table. This came up in the late spring, and again, that didn't work. So as a result, we ourselves, somewhat frustrated with the pace of events, decided that we needed to come up with a framework that would hopefully allow these two sides to get to the point where they could talk about elections. In a sense, we needed a dialogue which would allow people to have a dialogue, to talk about elections, which would then lead to having interim arrangements for the territories, which would then lead to having final status negotiations, and hopefully then a solution. That even our modest approach, in a sense, we had to make more modest, if you will. That's when we came up under Secretary Baker with our 5 points, the idea to provide a framework to get a Palestinian delegation and an Israeli delegation together, to come up with a framework that would help us choose a Palestinian delegation, to come up with a framework that would help decide what the two delegations would talk about when they sat down. If we can work this out, what we would have happen then is have the 3 foreign ministers, the American, the Egyptian, and the Israelis would meet. They would then come up with the final ground rules in order to get the Palestinian and the Israeli delegations together. In a sense, a pre-elections dialogue, so then you can have a pre-elections dialogue. And that is where we are right today. What is happening is that the issues really of Palestinian representation, which are at the heart of everything we have tried to cope with since the beginning, but these issues are still with us. And what is behind this is not simply a lack of trust that I alluded to in the beginning and all that, and a lack of also political authority, uncertain political authority on the various sides, but the phenomenon in the Middle East that everything is a potential precedent. What you learn is that even when you try to devise something that seems fairly modest, fairly innocuous, and fairly simple, that everyone puts it under a microscope and asks himself, what possible principle am I compromising? What precedent am I setting? And how might this affect where I am 3 years down the road, 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road? So quite honestly, it is proven difficult even to get the small steps going, but that is where we are, and we will continue to push it, again, because the basic logic of trying to be ambitious is simply not going to work. And I, for one, quite honestly find it hard to see how if modest approaches aren't going to work, why more ambitious ones are any more likely to. I would think just the opposite. In the meantime here, let me just sort of say 2 last things and then I'll stop. While we were putting our eggs, if you will, in this basket, on this step-by-step approach, on this approach of modesty, there's 2 other things I would say. One is I think there are steps that the various sides could take that would help create an environment which would be conducive to this process gaining some momentum. And these are the steps that Secretary Baker spelled out in his speech this spring to AIPAC, the American Israeli Public Affairs Committee, where he laid out an agenda to the various sides that we thought could complement a formal negotiating process. So while you've got this narrow track of negotiations, we thought there were things that the various parties could do away from the table that would help create an environment in which it would build confidence and give leaders the sense that maybe, just maybe, they could take some risks for peace. For example, we called upon the Israelis to take certain steps, things like to stop closings of schools, to stop and subsequently also we've made some statements to stop deportations of people from the West Bank, to stop settlements. We've made a great emphasis on that. Again, things that we thought would both help the day-to-day situation on the West Bank and Gaza, but also send a signal, a certain kind of political signal of openness. For the Palestinians, we said, why not amend the PLO charter formally? It still calls for the destruction of Israel. It's not enough for Yasser Arafat to stand up in Paris and say it's Haddouk. Let him take this issue to his membership and get a formal change. To the Arab states, we said things like end the boycott. Why don't you all think about extending recognition to Israel and so forth? Again, one can make up a long laundry list of what the various parties could do, but we thought we needed both a formal negotiating process and an informal negotiating process, and we're continuing to work along both tracks. Last point, I think our role in this is important. I'm not sure that you can't make peace without the United States, but history shows it's a lot easier to make peace with the United States, and we can probably facilitate matters. But that said, we can't deliver it. We cannot make peace by ourselves. And one of the points I constantly remind people is we cannot want to make peace any more than the participants themselves. Whenever that's the reality, when they are ready to make peace, in a sense, more than we are, then we can facilitate it. But we ourselves, or Washington, cannot hatch it, cannot hatch this process. The lesson of Camp David, and I'll end with this, is not that, and I don't mean this with any disrespect to Jimmy Carter, I think what the Carter administration did was important and essential for the process, but what made Camp David work was not the Americans and was not the mountain air of Maryland. What made Camp David work were people like Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin, who had both the vision and the political constituencies at home that let them make major compromises and, in a sense, carry out that vision. And right now, quite honestly, we don't yet have that situation. If and when we do, I'll be glad to invite people up to Maryland for a week or two. Until then, though, I think it would be a mistake to convene the parties, be it there or Geneva or anywhere else, but instead to patiently, yet consistently work to see if we can roll that stone up the hill. And that is exactly where we are as of November 1989.
Otto Allen. Mr. Allen.
Good evening. It's not my habit to discuss differences with my wife in front of large audiences, but last week I came home after Shamir's discussions with the administration, and I said my feeling is that the Middle East is not very high on the agenda of the administration, given the dramatic and historical developments in Eastern Europe. And she said, she doesn't speak Yiddish, but she said oy vey. And I asked her, why do you say that? And she said, well, I'm not so sure that we can get anything moving in the Middle East without the United States. And and it wasn't the first time or the last time, I begged to differ with her. And I said, I'm not so sure that this is the case. Maybe we are in a situation where we are best left to ourselves, we and the Palestinians and we and the Arabs at large. And if both of us look around and nobody is interested and nobody is fanning the fire, maybe we'll discover that we can reach a solution, because really the rest of the world is less interested in us and what we are doing and what we are not doing. And the truth is that it's a very difficult question. It is true that if you look at the history of the case, the United States was and is helpful. But I'm not so sure, and I have one or two points where I disagree with Richard on the role of the U.S., but I'll come to it in a minute. I want to preface my opening remarks by saying that I think that we have to, historically speaking, look at the conflicts at two levels. There is the 1948 level, and there is the 1967 level or aspect, or call it whatever you want. In 48, there was a serious problem of refugees created on both sides. 700,000 Arab Palestinians, and about the same number or slightly higher of Jewish refugees. One was solved, the other remained a problem. That is one level of the Arab Palestinian or the Israeli Arab-Palestinian conflict. We then have the 67 aspect of the conflict, which was created as a result of the war when Israel came to control the territories called the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, or the Israelis called them Judea and Samaria and the Gaza Strip. And they are not necessarily, there is a linkage between them, no doubt, but they are not necessarily the same nature. One has to do with territorial aspects, with security arrangements, with political aspirations, and I think that you can relatively easily solve them as compared to the other problems of what was created in 48. And where the U.S. is a miss of that is that confusing the two aspects of this of the conflict. Richard referred to the 4 points that are 4 elements, or the 4 corners of the Israeli initiative of May this year. The 4 points, or at least 2 of them, do deal with the 2 aspects. But let me go very quickly over the 4 points so we understand what we're talking about. The first point has to do with our relations with Egypt and expanding them. This is very important, not only because I dealt with it, but because Egypt is the largest Arab country with the strongest army, and if Egypt is actively involved in a peace process with Israel, that sends a very strong message to Arabs generally and to Palestinians particularly. So it's very important that we expand on this point. Then we go into the question of the second corner of the initiative is the relations with the Arab world. Even if we accept the maximum of territory for peace, what is the territory that Oman or Bahrain stand to gain from a peace treaty? Obviously, there is no territorial element there, and there's no reason why these countries can start and develop some sort of relations with Israel. I have in mind, for example, the visit that Peres paid as an official invitation by King Hassan II of Morocco, and I think that more of the same could help create a sense of confidence among the Israelis that the Arab world is seriously aiming at establishing along the road some peaceful relations with Israel. And it will send also a signal to the Palestinians that it's okay to go and sit down and talk to the Israelis. The third point has to do with the 48 aspect of the conflict, and that is the rehabilitation of the 48 refugees. This is the core of the problem. If we don't solve this problem, either before or simultaneously with the other aspect of the conflict, we are going to remain with the conflict, whatever we do with the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. As long as we don't tackle this problem seriously, there will be a community of 1 million or whatever the number is, it will say, our problem hasn't been solved, one way or the other. And we don't care what you did with Nablus and Ramallah and Hebron. We have a problem, you haven't solved it. And the fourth point has to do with the elections that Richard already worked on. And here I come to the point about where I differ with the U.S. Policy or policy makers. In December '88, the outgoing administration decided to open a dialogue with the PLO. And I won't go into the long argument whether the decision was justified upon the evidence or not. It's a fact now. But I say that this fact, to my mind, is hindering the process and hindering the progress towards some sort of even modest results that Richard was referring to. And why? Because it's confusing apples and oranges in a way. We have, as I said, two aspects of the conflict, and we can't solve them with the mechanism that involves the two. We have to sit down with a delegation of West Bankers and Gazans and to reach a solution based upon what I would call an approach of gradualism. And here I agree with you. And that includes, as I say, borders and security and political aspirations of both sides. And we do need to have an international effort which is aimed at solving a serious refugee problem. And it cannot be solved at the expense or at the price of wrecking the existing order in the Middle East, because you're going to create more problems rather than solve the problems by that. Putting the PLO by the dialogue in the middle of the picture is a destruction. To my mind, it creates a confusion, and therefore I think it takes the process back rather than push it forward. I also believe that sooner or later the Palestinians themselves living on the West Bank, and maybe the others as well, are going to discover this. We are now talking about an organization which is 25 years old, was created in 1964, and has not produced, to the best of my knowledge, 1 inch of territory or 1 iota of independence. And sooner or later, the two communities that I'm talking about, those of 48 and those of 67, are going to ask themselves the question. We have paid all the respect, we have paid all the allegiance, but where did it lead us? And this process among the West Bank and the Gazans may take, I don't know, several years, for a new leadership to emerge, which will be capable of saying, we ought to deal with the Israelis, we ought to sit down with the Israelis, there's no other choice, on the basis of the existing situation, on the existence or an acceptance of Israel as a fact, as a reality. You pointed your finger, Richard, to the fact that with all the various statements that were made by Arafat, the fact remains that the one single test was not passed, and that is changing the covenant. And the covenant is the embodiment of the aspirations and of the goals of an organization which does not accept 48, the creation of the State of Israel, as a reality, as a fact. Now, I also noticed that you failed, and I'm not so sure that it was accidentally, you failed to mention Camp David. If it was accidentally, then I take my words back. My feeling is that this is a very important instrument. I'm not wedded to every word that is uttered or written in Camp David. I'm talking about the concept. Because here you have the reflection of the gradualism that I think is very important. We're talking about a century-long conflict. It's a conflict which is now well over 100 years old. And you have a very deep residue of animosity, hostility on both sides. Mistrust. And I think that it's very important that we solve it in what I would call an educational basis. We both have to sit down, work out the stages, and try and learn to live together in a responsible way. And that is something which, that is the genius, I think, of Camp David. And I'm very sorry that people sort of give this instrument lip service rather than go into the heart of it as a part of the mechanism, part of the process. I won't reveal any big secret when I say that the Israeli plan, the fourth corner dealing with the elections, is basically Camp David with the adjustment of the elections which come in the new Israeli initiative at the end of the process, rather somewhere in the middle of it. And it's a big gamble. We discussed before we came in the fact that taking such a step is sometimes very risky. You look around what happens in Eastern Europe and you say, okay, we're willing to have a democracy. Okay, we're willing to have elections in Jordan. And very quickly you discover that you started something and you don't necessarily have control over the development, over the consequences of the very elections that you called for. And so I think that it's a very major step taken by the Israeli government when they say, okay, we're willing to go through elections and see what happens, and we're willing to accept the consequences of this election. I don't think that the U.S. differs with us on the question of the elections, but I do believe that we have some problems ahead, which we can discuss later, in some of the modalities, or rather the categories that can participate, but I'll leave it to the next round.
Some people in Washington saying there's so many points in all these Middle East peace plans that you should say that the Bush administration is trying to put all the 1,000 points of light in this part of the globe, but I'm not sure how much light there is actually there. It does seem very opaque at the moment to see how we're going to get from the present through to some kind of reasonable peacemaking process. The fundamental problem, I think, is that you have this reluctance on behalf of the two most powerful parties in this conflict, that is the US and Israel, the reluctance to go out front and actually lead the process. On behalf of the United States, we had an excellent exposition from Richard this evening, showing that the United States position is essentially one of gradualism, of not getting out ahead of the two parties on the ground, of letting the two parties on the ground make the pace in this whole peacemaking process. From the Israeli point of view, you also have tremendous reluctance to come out in front. For example, even some of the most hard-nosed and realistic people who are looking at the peacemaking process in Israel, who produced a really remarkable study at the Jaffe Center earlier this year, looking at the strategic consequences of peace, looking at the peacemaking process. In the end, they said there were certain steps that had to be taken that would best come from the United States rather than from the government of Israel. So here you have the traditional kind of situation that the French refer to as the Alphonse and Gaston syndrome, where the two guys are standing at the door of the elevator saying, after you, Alphonse, after you, Gaston. Meanwhile, the elevator doors snap closed and it takes off who knows where. I think that is a fundamental problem here when you're talking about Palestinian-Israeli peacemaking. And for the United States government, which is actually paying the piper in terms of the aid and financial aid and political aid that it unfailingly gives to Israel, to say that it has no role in leading this process, I think is not exactly helpful or even at times very honest. There are two issues that the peace process is presently stuck on. Two very fundamental issues, and it's hard to see how they can be resolved in this Alphonse and Gaston situation, short of a major crisis, which I can assure you can happen at any time out there. The situation might look stable, it might look as though the killing rate has been reduced to merely 1.2 2 people per day on a monthly basis, or whatever it is currently in the occupied territories, with maybe the 1 killed by the IDF and the 0.2 killed by the Palestinians between themselves. It has become remarkably stable. It has become remarkably institutionalized. There is, at the very fundamental level of daily life in the occupied territories, a situation of real dual power in the situation, in the sense described by socialist historians throughout the decades. You have the authority of the IDF, which is unquestioned at the strategic level, which maintains control over all the roads, over all the major things that go into and out of the occupied territories. But at the level of people's everyday life, without fail, they follow the leaflets that come out. Every 3 weeks or so, the leaflet will lay down the timetable for what one should do over the days to come. The strikes continue according to the schedule. The activities, going to visit the families of the martyrs, giving the victory gardens, this and that, all the other activities of the Intifada continue according to schedule. So you have this real duality in people's lives that has not been, they haven't escalated the self-activity to the point of challenging the occupation in any meaningful way yet. And meanwhile, the occupation is unable to take control of the daily life. So it looks very stable, but at any moment, between the settlers and the real anger of many of the Palestinians, all of whom have had their families affected very directly, either by death, injuring, arrest, detention without trial, a few cases, 60 cases since the beginning of the Intifada of deportation. Of course, every household budget has been slashed by more than half. Everybody is taking part. There's a lot of anger in there. And at any time, you could see something like the bus incident that occurred last July that would not just stop there, but that would ignite a settlers' reaction. I don't know who would start it, but the settlers are also angry. We could see blood spilled, Palestinian and Jewish blood spilled there. That would be truly horrifying. And I hope it doesn't take that, the U.S. policy, for everybody's policy, to get into a serious peacemaking mode. Let's get back to what the 2 fundamental issues are at the moment. They're the ones where the most basic kind of diplomacy is taking place now, primarily between our own government and the government of Israel, also with the PLO and the Egyptians having their input. These 2 issues are the issues of the linkage between the final status agreement and any interim step that might occur. And the second, the issue of Palestinian representation. Now, in both of these issues, the U.S., in a sense, is trying to fudge over or to use diplomatese in order to get past the Israeli premier's very real reluctance to engage on these issues. I actually agree with Minister Iran that one cannot totally ignore the final status issues, such final status issues as the resettlement of the refugees. But that has to be a part of a stable peace. On the other hand, I would, of course, disagree with what he's saying, that this is the problem for the Arab countries, that the Israelis have nothing to say to the Palestinian refugees, both those from 48 and those from 67 and those since 67, who have left the areas that are now under Israeli control. Premier Shamir has said that he has no business with those Palestinian refugees who are outside of the traditional areas of the Palestinian homeland. That's not true. He cannot escape, the Israeli government cannot escape the fact that it has to deal with the issue of the refugees. Now, at the moment, the international community, the General Assembly, is still basing this question on the right of return. The Palestinians themselves are saying this does not have to be necessarily returned to the original piece of property that was left in 1948, that was since expropriated by the Israelis and is now being used by the Israelis, and all the benefits of ownership are enjoyed by the Israelis. The Palestinians are saying we can resolve the right of return in the context of the alternative of compensation. And of course, if we're talking about compensation, it will be the Western world that compensates, probably not Israel. But they want to resettle according to their kind of agenda, according to their kind of national priorities, which include the resettlement of a substantial proportion of these refugees within the entity, the Palestinian entity that they are hoping to build. And of course, if one looks at the refugees, you have to say that the people who need a settlement more than anybody right now are the Palestinian refugees living in Lebanon, who've had no kind of security for the past 8 or 10 years or more. The Palestinians are talking about the kind of ingathering of the exiles that the Jewish community should know only too well. And when Abba Eban, for example, talks about this kind of ingathering of the exiles in terms of the Palestinians, he says, and I've heard him, maybe you've heard him in this forum, I've heard him on many occasions say, in 48 we didn't ask people whether they were Jews to prove it this way or that way. Anybody who was crazy enough to say they were Jews welcomed them into our state. And the Palestinians say the same. We have the right to say who can come into our entity when we create it. What they want is the right to create that entity with the control over the borders vested in themselves. Now that's a final status issue, you might say, but it comes up immediately when you look at the question of elections. Who gets a vote? Who gets to stand? So somebody who the Shamir government deported last week get to vote, get to stand in the election? It's a difficult question. Shamir himself would say no. He would say anybody that's outside of the borders controlled by the IDF doesn't have anything to do with this process. The Palestinians and the US government both say that that is not a sufficient answer. I think, as I understand it, that the US government position is that Palestinians from outside as well as inside have to have some input into this peace process, and that the kind of negotiating team we're talking about would contain representatives of both. Indeed, this whole attempt by the Shamir government to drive a wedge between the Palestinians from inside and outside is really totally fallacious. It's as though they were two different sociological groups. Whereas if you talk to any Palestinian from inside, you will find that roughly half of his immediate family is outside. You cannot talk about a long-term stable settlement for Sari Nusaybi of East Jerusalem unless you also talk about his elder brother Zaki, who is in Abu Dhabi. You cannot talk about somebody being able to carry out normal family life in his homeland unless you let his brothers, his sisters, his uncles, his aunts come in to visit or to stay according to what their desire is. Just another point about this division between the inside and the outside. I spent 6 weeks in the occupied territories in the summer. I went to Gaza, I went to Nablus, I went to many villages. I traveled around. I've also twice this year been to Tunis and held discussions with the PLO leaders there. The amazing thing to me is that this anger that you get at the grassroots right now puts the people on the inside far to the radical side of what the political position of the PLO leadership is. So when you're talking about the need to engage the PLO leadership in the peace process, it's not just an abstract ideological issue. It's the fact that they are the only people now with the kind of historical charisma to be able to sell to the Palestinians the kind of concessions that will be necessary if you're going to have a peace process. There is nobody on the inside who could do that. There are a number of reasons for this. One is that systematically, since 1967, since the Israelis occupied these territories, anybody who has pretended to occupy a position or attempted to occupy a position of national leadership that was inside the occupied territories found themselves outside, deported. We're not just talking about the 60-plus people deported since the beginning of the Intifada. We're talking about more than 2,000 community activists who've been deported from the occupied territories since '67. These are the people that have occupied leadership positions in any society, whether we're talking about religious leaders, teachers, union organizers, community organizers in terms of social services. Anybody that pretended to speak for the entire national community was deported. What does that leave you with? That leaves you with a very atomized, very underdeveloped kind of national elite on the inside. Many wonderful people, many wonderful individuals, but if you look at the kind of political experience they have, the kind of political constituency they have, and put it alongside the experience and constituency of the PLO leaders outside, or of the deported community leaders, the deported mayors, the deported union leaders who are outside, then the people on the inside inevitably pale in that comparison. That's one reason that they look to the outside for leadership. On the outside, you have this leadership that, as Minister Iran said, has been in existence now for something approaching 25 years. He's right, they haven't liberated an inch of Palestine. But then until about a month ago, Sam Nujoma hadn't liberated an inch of Namibia. But he was able to go back. The kind of popular movement, the kind of political things that happened inside Namibia brought him back. I think it would be folly, short-sighted folly, to rule out Yasser Arafat and the current leadership of the PLO on that basis. I think actually it would be worse than that. I think it would be the height of irresponsibility, because the successor coalition to Yasser Arafat is not a moderate kind of coalition from inside of people who want to do a deal with the Israelis based on the present power equation and act as the kind of the compliant Palestinian leadership that perhaps Shamir is looking for. The successor to Yasser Arafat will most certainly lie on the radical side of the spectrum, will most probably come from the Islamic fundamentalist movement. And if you think it's hard now, on the basis of competing nationalisms, to resolve these very real, very thorny issues of resettlement of refugees, of Jerusalem, of access to water rights, these are real issues. I agree. They have to be resolved. But it's hard enough to resolve them on the basis of competing nationalisms. But imagine how you would deal with the question of Jerusalem if you're dealing with fundamentalists on both sides, because the fundamentalists are also growing on the Israeli side. I've been stoned in a refugee camp by Arab radicals, but I've also been caught in the middle of a Jewish lynch mob in Shmuel Hanebi Street in Jerusalem. And both experiences are terrifying. I think really that you have to take what you have now in terms of the nationalist leadership. You don't have to like them, but at least as a kind of world power, as a power with responsibilities and rights in that region, the United States should deal with these leaderships and do it soon. I think that Richard gave us a very good explanation of the gradualist kind of approach. I would just submit that it's not going to get us anywhere before that crisis occurs.
Would either Mr. Owen and Mr. House like to come back with just a sentence or two?
One or two points of fact. You said that we have nothing to say about the question of the 48 refugees, and this is not true. I mean, we, in the fourth point, if I may just read very quickly as a point of fact, Israel calls for an international endeavor to resolve the problem of the residents of the Arab refugee camps in Judea, Samaria, and the Gaza district in order to improve their living conditions and to rehabilitate them. Israel is prepared to be a partner in this endeavor. So we are willing to participate in this effort.
The refugees that are outside your defense zone.
That that may be the case, because I think that this is not in terms of the rehabilitation, but in terms of participation in the political process, which are two different things. I mean, I think we are confusing, maybe not willfully, but we're confusing participation in the process of elections on the West Bank and the Gaza Strip and the rehabilitation of the refugee program. This is true. The idea of the elections is directed to the inhabitants of the Samaria and the Gaza Strip. They are not. The idea is not directed to anyone else beyond that. And I do come here to the problems of the problems of that are created by you speaking of people speaking about representation of outsiders. And I speak here the problem generally, not only about certain categories of outsiders, although I think that outside deportees are in certain cases euphemism for PLO, but we'll leave it for a minute. I think that you are not going to solve anything in the immediate future if you're going to insist that Palestinians residing in Abu Dhabi because they left there in order to, for one reason or another, mostly economic reasons, or to Kuwait, that if you're going to insist that they participate in the process that we are talking about it now, you're going nowhere. Not technically and not politically. I think it's a deal breaker, absolutely. And I don't want to mince words about it. Secondly, the linkage. There is a linkage between the current idea of elections, the interim status, and the final status. We recognize it. We don't think the elections are an end in itself. We do believe that they should lead to negotiations over the final status. Absolutely. We don't shy in saying that. We just don't say that.
Okay, well, we turn to the audience now, and let's start with direct questions. Please say if there's any particular member of the panel you want to answer the question, or whether you want everybody to have a go at it. Please.
My question is, my name is Glenn Schwaber. I'm a student here in the Government College. My question is directed to Ms. Coven and Mr. Haas. You both noted or stated that Israel is trying to draw a direct wedge between the Palestinians in the territories and that the PLO leadership in Tunis is irresponsible. I'm not sure that. My question is, why are the Palestinians of Jordan being left out of this process? I think even the Israelis have kind of shied away from the Jordanian option, and I'm not sure why, if democracy is being captured all over Eastern Europe, why it can't be spread to the Arab world. It seems kind of hypocritical that we should avow freedom and democracy for all peoples except in Jordan. And I think if Hussein could convert in like Spain to a constitutional monarchy, there'll be a lot more room for maneuver there.
I'm not sure I quite understand the question. Let me make 2 points. One is the elections that just took place in Jordan, I think, are a significant step. One of the parts of the Middle East that, quite honestly, I find disappointing by any measure has been the lack of democracy. And the fact that we just had parliamentary elections in Jordan after almost unprecedented degree of open campaigning is an interesting development in sort of the decentralization of our political power. So I think that is something to be acknowledged. In terms of Jordan and the peace process, it's been, a year and a half now since King Hussein made the decision that Jordan is not Palestine, that he was no longer going to represent the Palestinians in their search for the satisfaction of their national ambitions. And as a result, coming on the heels of Egypt's, in a sense, statement along the same lines that they were not going to act as was anticipated under Camp David, it meant the Palestinians had to fend for themselves, which is really where we are. And I think one of the important developments of the last year with the Israeli plan of May 14th is that you've got the Israelis for the first time willing to confront Palestinians directly about the political future of this part of the world, and which is in some reasons why it's so difficult. That said, I don't think Jordan is gone from the picture forever. Helena mentioned some things. This part of the world is too small to think that you can somehow have a lasting peace that doesn't involve Jordan, whether it's issues of water or military questions or economic questions. Some of our notions of sovereignty are increasingly obsolete given geography and given the kind of functional relationships that are inevitable. So inevitably, Jordan will have a role in the peace process, whether it's formal or informal or at the table or away from the table, it will be involved.
Martin Latch, I'm at the law school here. I'd actually like to build on that question, addressing Mr. Haas, and ask you whether or not you feel that the elections in Jordan were a positive development in terms of the peace process, given the fact that the fundamentalist portion of the population there made some rather significant gains, and whether or not that essentially wrote off King Hussein from the peace process in the near future, saying that he have to deal with that portion of the population on his own, and that it almost per se limits the extent to which he can deal with the Israelis and the Palestinians on the West Bank and the occupied territory.
Different from what I already said. I think one of the things I did before I went into government is wisely or not, I wrote a lot. And certainly unwisely, I published a lot. One of the things I published is an article in National Interest about the importance of authoritarian regimes developing political structures that began to decentralize economic and political decision-making. In Jordan, over the last year, you've had signs of certain challenges to authority. And the fact that you are now beginning a process of political decentralization, quite honestly, I don't know how far or how fast it will go, I think is a very far-sighted undertaking. I think we've learned, in some cases the hard way, that unless you give people a stake in their society and a stake in their government, they're not going to defend it when it comes under attack, and indeed they may lead the attack themselves. So again, I think what King Hussein did was quite far-sighted. That said, one of the downsides of elections, if they're going to be fair and honest, as this one apparently was, is you can't guarantee who wins. And the Islamic fundamentalists did well by any measure and did somewhat better than the so-called experts predicted. I think this is part of the process of Jordan working things out economically and politically at home. You've got a population in Jordan today that's roughly two-thirds Palestinian. You've got all sorts of tendencies, Islamic and secular. You've got economic problems. I think King Hussein and the Jordanian people and this new parliament have their hands full. Again, but long before these elections, Jordan had, in a sense, taken itself out of the front lines of the peace process. I don't see these elections changing that. And again, somewhere down the road, if I'm right, and if our gradualism does lead to something more over time, I do not think you can ever reach final status issues in the Middle East and not take into account the interests and influence of Jordan. That's simply a fact of life.
Next question over there. Sorry, forgive me, but we've got quite a few questions. Yes, please.
My name is Michael Zabrensky. I work at the Kennedy School. I'd like to accept an assumption that Professor Caban made and then ask you a question. I agree with the assumption, which is that the importance of America in the peace process and perhaps the indispensability of progress without America's participation. My question to you is, given the point that has been made by everyone about all the events that are happening throughout the world, sort of forcing the Middle East issue down on America's priority list, and also given the strength of the Israeli lobby, AIPAC and others in America, which was not talked about, how do you realistically expect America to play this important role in the peace process?
So who are you speaking?
To Professor Caban, but anyone else wants to respond.
I think that maybe rather than being a kind of administration-led charge toward the peace process, what we might see and what we have seen some of the seeds of already is that the incredible and really historic strength of the American Jewish community itself might start to get pushed behind the peace process and might push the administration. We've already seen important stirrings in the organized American Jewish community, and I know for a fact that many Jewish families here are wrestling with this issue over the dinner table with their friends and so on and so forth. Last summer there was really a historic breakthrough in terms of the degree to which mainstream organizations in the American Jewish community would challenge the official position of the government of Israel on the peace process. This occurred when that well-known defender of Jewish causes, Senator Jesse Helms, put forward an amendment that would restrict the U.S.-PLO dialogue to a debilitating degree with the backing of AIPAC, with the backing of the government of Israel. And not only the kind of far-out leftist Jewish organizations that aren't considered part of the mainstream opposed this, but also for the first time you had the Reform rabbis and the AJA Congress going up on the Hill to lobby directly against AIPAC. That was a watermark, that was a landmark kind of event, and it's just a symptom of what's happening inside the American Jewish community. I am convinced that the kind of values that large numbers of American Jews hold dear are the kind of democratic values which are directly offended by the sight of soldiers killing unarmed civilians. And I'm extremely hopeful that those kind of values will be thrown into the struggle for a peaceful and democratic outcome.
Mr. Iran, I have a question for you. You pointed out four reasons why the negotiation will not get through, and I have concerns something else with this. Second, the Israeli government had the initiative since 2007, certainly since Camp David, to do something about the situation, and nothing happened. Actually, if Sadat didn't get on the plane and go to see Begin, it would have never been Camp David to start with. And now you have said that you're saying the PLO, you're going to wait for the PLO, you would not deal with them. They stay away right back from the people, and we can have dialogue. You also very rightly pointed out that the PLO did nothing for people in 20 years. Now, it took out of Jordan, out of Lebanon, it cost everybody money, it did nothing, it was still there in love. Now that's finally giving the people a chance to get somewhere. How can you expect that at this point they're going to kick them out and have somebody else do it?
First point again, Samaria. You know, my hobby is Jerusalem, and I collect books about Jerusalem, and most of them deal with the Holy Land generally, and there's a chapter in each one of them. In fact, I wish I had more time to browse around the shops here in Boston. These are the names. The 19th century. You open the pages of every book. It says Judea and Samaria. What should I call them? You want to use the legal terminology and call it Palestine? What Palestine? You want to include Jordan in it? You want to include Tel Aviv in it? What do you include in the word? So I think that we are quibbling over maybe an important issue, but certainly not the most important issue. And I don't think that we should concentrate on it. I have no problem calling it Judea and Samaria, by the way. As I said, I think that they denote two sub-territories in the whole area called the West Bank. Camp David. I didn't follow your question, I must admit. In Camp David, two regional countries, Egypt and Israel, unfortunately there weren't others, agreed on a process. There were two parts to Camp David. One had to do with the bilateral relations between Egypt and Israel, and this is not the place to deal with it. The other part of Camp David dealt with the Palestinian issue, the Arab Palestinian issue. And we were looking for interlocutors. No Palestinian, period, stood up and said, I'm willing to accept Camp David, I'm willing to accept the theory, I therefore joined the process, I joined the negotiation. At that point, the Egyptians said, well, we don't want to leave it at that, we'll negotiate with Israel on behalf of the Palestinians. I don't know that they were mandated to do it, but they did talk to us. And as we know, nothing came out of it. And so we are now back to the issue 10 years later with a modified version with the same philosophy, at least on our part, and I'm glad to hear that the philosophy is also accepted by the U.S. administration. And this is what we are doing now. We're trying to find a way to open a dialogue between Israelis and Palestinians. That's exactly what the U.S. administration is involved, as I understand it. The Israeli government is involved, and what the Egyptian government is.
Next question. Sorry.
You asked the third question about the PLO and me saying that sooner or later the Palestinians are going to phase them out. That's obviously my hope, that they will realize that we are not going to sit with the PLO. And that's not the only reason. I mean, this is a reason for me. It's not maybe a good reason for Palestine to accept it. But that they are going to realize that there was no fruit borne out by this organization. And if at all this organization took them years back rather than push their destiny years forward. This is my analysis of the situation. Maybe you read it differently, but I think that the fact that there are no results, positive results of what this organization has done, will be taken into consideration in the very near future by the Palestinians themselves.
And just returning from Israel recently, I'd like to jump the question just a little bit forward and address my question to Professor Koopman. Having gone through Judea and Samaria briefly, certainly, I just wonder, at some point in time, there is some sympathy within the Israeli government to discuss or to talk to the PLO, and eventually, at some point in time, it seems inevitable that there's going to be some kind of a Palestinian entity on the West Bank. What that shape is going to be and what form it's going to take is still obviously out in the future. But I'd like to assume that there is a state in the West Bank. I would really like to know how is that entity politically and economically going to survive. There is nothing there.
I've actually been looking at some of these issues in a different light. I was looking at the issues of what elements of sovereignty are the rock bottom for the Palestinians, because obviously they will have to give up a lot of the elements of sovereignty if they are to get this kind of a political outcome. They won't be allowed, for example, to have unlimited military establishment. In fact, some of them themselves talk about the limitations on the military establishment being so extreme. In the words of Faiz Abu Rahma from Gaza, maybe even the police force will have to wear bathing shorts to make sure that everybody knows they're not carrying guns. When you look at the economy, actually, things are not as bad as they seem right now. There has to be enormous investment in infrastructure in this Palestinian entity. Some of the investment that would, under any enlightening form of occupation, have been taking place over the last 22 years, but that's a past story to a certain extent now. Palestinian economists have been working on this issue off and on for the past 10 or 15 years with much more urgency now. One of the most authoritative of them is a person in Cairo called Nabil Shah, who's a member of the PNC and is himself an active economics consultant. He puts together figures of the kind of infrastructural investment that would be necessary, somewhere between 10 and $20 billion to start with. And he's quite optimistic that this kind of money can be raised within a short period. And of course, if you look at, for example, the aid that the Saudis were giving to the Iraqis during the war, which was running at $1 billion a month, just for junk, I mean bullets and stuff like that, which are consumable, then that kind of aid looks manageable. And that's one thing. But of course, the Palestinians, because of their experience with the Arab regimes, are extremely reluctant to become indebted to the Arab regimes. They put themselves in their economic thrall. The first kind of resource they will be looking to is their own capital. There is a tremendous amount of Palestinian capital waiting in the diaspora to be repatriated. And I think, from my sense of the Palestinian capitalists that I know, the bankers in the Gulf or in London, the big consultants in Saudi Arabia or in Luxembourg, all of them, they have a very deep level of gut nationalism. I think their rate of repatriation of capital will be quite impressive by third world standards. And certainly the kind of outcome that you'll get of an alternative economic pole being created, if you like, inside the occupied territories, to the existing pole of the Israeli economy, can only be healthy all around, although it will drive up labor costs in the short term for the Israelis. But above and beyond that, both economies necessarily will be opened to the Arab hinterland, which can only be of benefit to both.
We have 10 minutes left and 3 questions, so may I ask my questioners and my repliers to be very brief, and then we can take all our 3 questions. But I would please our panel please to be very brief. First question, sir.
I'll try to be brief. My name is David Aronson, and I have a question for Mr. Iran, and perhaps Mr. Haas would like to take a crack at it. Your suggestion, Mr. Iran, that perhaps this was a time that U.S. leave Israel and the Arabs alone was interesting. I find it, I might say, a little naive. I'd make that point in this way, excuse me. Mr. Shamir gave a much more forward-looking proposal until he went to the meeting of his party, then found that Mr. Sharon and others disagreed and moved back on that, and the points that came out of it were simply much more conservative. And I wonder how you believe that Mr. Shamir and his bloc, the Herut, will actually be able to move without some sort of outside pressure, since it has taken, it seems to me, 10 years and this kind of pressure to get to this point. And perhaps you have some other thoughts on that.
I don't mind being accused of being naive. It's fine. After so many accusations which were leveraging at me in the last few years, it's not the worst one. I didn't suggest it. I said just that it occurred to me that I didn't have time to develop it, and I don't think that I was given the time now. The United States doesn't come alone. Sooner or later, it will have to carry with it the Europeans, the Russians. The Russians haven't given up the Middle East, certainly not politically, and they may be. I hope that they one day they will stop the arms shipments to the Middle East, but they haven't given it up politically. So they are going to say to the United States, "Hey, you are part of this region, and you cannot exclude us." So immediately you have other onlookers coming in, and I don't think it's a very healthy process. The United States itself played a very constructive role with the two as an arms broker, and we hope that this is the case, but I'm not so sure that we, as I said, we can exclude others. Secondly, as to the point of Sharon, this is a very serious constraint. I don't deny that. I think that Elena spoke about settlers. This is a small but a very vocal element in the Israeli society, Israeli body politics. I think you have Sharon, and I think that the proof is that the government, when it approved the Baker 5 points on November 6th, the Prime Minister was in a very embarrassing situation, but he went into this situation knowingly. 3 out of 6 members of the Likud members on the cabinet voted against him. But I think that it shows that his seriousness and his willingness to go ahead with his own initiative by the very fact that he relied in this particular case, and he may have to do it in the future, on the support of the Labour Party for this initiative. It's a democracy. It's a true democracy. People that can express their views. I think that just as we had a coalition in Camp David, which broke party lines, the traditional party lines, in order to give support to this plan in 1978, you will see the same situation if we have a serious process, we have serious negotiations, and we have a real outcome of this negotiation. Then I suggest and I submit to you that there will be people against it. In both parties, both Likud and Labour. The same situation which occurred in 77 and 78. It's part of the democracy, and I suggest that we would have a majority if there is a serious negotiation and a serious outcome of this negotiation.
Next question.
I'm Karen Leader. I'm a student at the law school, and I have a question for Professor Kavan. Two questions, actually. The first is that in the presentation you expressed a great deal of sympathy for the Palestinians. However, you neglected, I think, to bring up another issue, and that is Israel's concern with their own self-preservation. And you didn't address the 2 points that both Mr. Haas and Minister Iran brought up, and that is the concern with the Palestinians' failure to eliminate the clause in their charter that concerns Israel's right to exist. I'd like to hear what you have to say about that. And the second issue is you also brought up the point that there are 2 countries that are in the forefront, and that is Israel and the United States. However, Minister Iran brought up that the Arab countries also have a great deal of responsibility in this crisis, and I question you didn't bring out that as a responsibility yourself.
On the PLO charter, I think if I get to talk to Yasser Arafat in the near future, I would tell him he should do it. He should revoke the charter. On the other hand, I understand, because I've talked with him and with others, what their reasoning for not doing this is. He says that it's caduc, and when one presses for what the heck does this mean anyway, they say it's kind of OBE, overtaken by events, superseded by the decisions, the very difficult decisions of the PNC of last November. Now, I think if those decisions of the 1988 PNC had led in a fairly rapid manner to the opening of direct negotiations with the Israeli government, which is what the PLO leaders say they want to get into, whether directly or indirectly. But if the process had marched fast, one might have seen some kind of movement on this issue of the charter. But what happened was that the PLO leaders made what they considered to have been a huge historical reevaluation of their current policy, accepting the two-state solution, accepting Resolution 181 of the United Nations. And then they got nothing in return, so it made it hard for them to go back to their constituents and argue that, well, we should go one step further and revoke the charter. Their position at the moment, and I just recount it to you without supporting it, is that when negotiations start, everybody should bring their charters, including those of the Herut and the other organizations. I think it's the Herut which has a map that shows, all of Jordan as well as all of Palestine and Israel as being part of the Eretz Israel, that everybody should bring their charters, put them on the table, and decide, is this charter helpful or isn't it? And then maybe they'll all end up in a crash heap on the floor, but that they feel, the Palestinians, that they have actually given enough concessions for now. And I think, that you have to recognize that this leadership of the PLO does have a lot of pressures on it from the base. There is a committee of Palestinians to preserve the charter, and that's a force he has to take into account. I would argue that he should take a chance, but then he's the guy who always has to take the risks of the chances. About the Arab countries, I think Richard certainly, and possibly also Minister Iran, mentioned the role of Egypt, which I think has been most helpful in the current phase. Egypt, of course, being the biggest, the weightiest by any measure of all the Arab countries. Syria remains a problem, but it's not the kind of active obstructing role that one saw in previous rounds of the peace process.
Last and final question.
My name is Joachim Martillo, and I'm a principal technical consultant at Goodpoint Research Corporation. I have noticed in the press of Muslim countries from, say, Tunisia to Malaysia, sort of an increasing hostility towards the U.S. over the past few years. I have the impression this hostility is probably due to unfulfilled economic expectations, and I have to ask Mr. Haas if, by concentrating on this relatively local issue, we may be ignoring a bigger problem in the future. Debating style. Let me not accept your premise. I have not noticed tremendous hostility in the Arab world or the Muslim world, to make it more broad, towards the United States. To the contrary. If I look at countries like Turkey, like Pakistan, Indonesia, Saudi Arabia, virtually all the countries of North Africa except for Libya, Egypt, many of the countries of the Gulf and the Middle East, I would think that the United States is able to maintain good relations with Muslim countries. By and large, I think there's some unique things with Libya and Iran that are the clear exceptions, and clearly some of the Islamic fundamentalists around the Middle East are fairly hostile, not simply to the United States, but in many ways to Westernism, to secularism, and so forth. But by and large, how would I put it? I think we're able to maintain good relations or working relations despite the differences over the so-called Palestinian problem. And my hunch is if we can make some substantial progress on this problem, things would be that much better. But I don't see any fundamental divide there.
Right, thank you very much indeed. I don't think any of our panel wants a final word. But if not, let me thank you all very much indeed. And conclude this forum. So Minister Iran, Mr. House, and Professor Cobham, thank you very much indeed.